All right, let's kick this off then. Well, first, welcome and thank you everyone for coming to our May Scholar Strategy Network event, the do's and don'ts of community engaged research. My name is Lauren Nolan. I am one of the graduate fellows working with the New Jersey, Philadelphia chapter of SSN. I'm also a doctoral student at the Rutgers Blaustein School. We have four fantastic panelists with us today. Before I introduce them, though, just a few thank yous and housekeeping items. First, thank you to everyone who made today possible. Our co-leads, Dr. Julia Sass-Rubin and Susan DeJarnett, Esquire, who are, like I said, our two chapter co-leads. I also want to say thank you to Stephanie, who's my other fellow counterpart, Stephanie Holcomb, here at the NJ Philly chapter of SSN. We are going to be doing audience Q&A, so feel free at any point to drop your question in the chat, and we will get to Q&A later in the event. Also, as I said before, if you can just keep yourself muted to limit background noise, that would be wonderful. And without further ado, I will introduce our speakers. You can read a bit more about their bios in the flyer for the event, so I'll just briefly do name and institution, and then we will launch into our first question. And thank you again so much to our panelists for being here today, this afternoon. So we've got on our panel, Dr. Akira Drake Rodriguez, who's an assistant professor at the Weitzman School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania in urban planning. We have Dr. Kate Jackson, who recently finished her dissertation, congratulations to her, and is now going to be in the fall an assistant professor at Lehigh University in their environment department. Dr. Edwin Mayorga, who is an associate professor at Swarthmore College and focuses on education. And finally, Dr. Nancy Wolff, who's a distinguished professor at Rutgers University and also runs the Survey Research Center there, and whose focuses in criminal justice. So I will launch right into our first question. And so I want to talk a bit about what community engaged research is and how we think about it. And so I'm just going to present a brief definition, a brief starting point for us. And we are defining community engaged research as the process of working collaboratively with groups of people affiliated by geographic proximity, special interests, or similar situations with respect to issues affecting their well-being. And so I want to turn this over to our panelists now and have them speak a bit about how they think about community engaged research. And in that question, tell us a bit about the work they do and the groups they've worked with. And so I will go in alphabetical order, and I'm going to start with Akira.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. So yeah, I think community engaged research is a large sort of field at this point. I know, if you're in public health, if you're in medicine, if you're in sociology, I'm in planning, so it feels almost like second nature. We work a lot with communities. We're often addressing real life and real-time problems with them. Maybe not in the fastest way because of academic publishing and grant writing, but we are working through it together. And it feels quite, obviously, like there are levels to it too as well. So how engaged are you with the community? How engaged are they in the actual research design process, the research data collection process, the writing, the dissemination? And I think it, doesn't always have to be, it sounds kind of like bad to start off this way, but I don't think it has to be everyone's giving like 50-50 in this process. I think very much so like a comparative advantage, who can do what well, and who has the time and capacity and the resources to actually execute and implement that. So the work that I do, I used to do a lot of historical work on tenant organizing, and now I do work, contemporary work with organizations and groups and individuals actually around public schools in Philadelphia, particularly around the condition of our school facilities, which are quite toxic. So this is something that's, I don't know, it's very interesting because it's what I essentially study is slow violence. And I'm working with people in real time around solutions and ideas and concepts that are really, really large, really, really traumatizing, and really are not things that are going to be solved in a day, if they're solved at all. And so I think that is also like really an important thing about community engaged research, is that it does provide some community, right? You're not like alone out there thinking about these problems, obsessed with these problems. You're in community with people. You get to talk about it a lot. And I think that's also like really helpful, is that particularly for marginalized communities, to be able to have access to resources and conferences and spaces where you can talk about this issue and have a platform, I think is also really important. So certainly that's sort of like my general takeaway, is that it's a large field. How engaged you and the community are really varies across topic, and what everyone can give, I think also sort of depends by field, by discipline, by the scope of the project. And so it would be hard to give one solid definition, but I do think there's a lot of variance for good and bad across it.
Thanks, Akira. Let's go to Edwin.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you. I actually am doing some community engaged work as we speak, which is why I'm speaking to everyone from my car. You know, I think my colleague and friend Akira did a really nice job, I think, of, or I would echo what Akira has articulated, which is the broad spectrum of what we might think about as engaged and community engaged work. I would say, so, you know, given what Akira's already laid out, what I'll drill down into a little bit is my own particular stance on it and how I engage in that practice. For me, it's two things. One that I'll highlight here. One is the notion of not just engaged but community driven, and the other piece is answerability. And I'll get to that in a minute. What I mean by community driven work in my particular case is finding and creating the opportunities and space for the brilliance of communities on the ground, people experiencing that slow violence, that kind of drip feed violence that Akira has talked about, and creating opportunities for them to be engaged and leading with the particular questions, problems, issues that they are seeking to address and answer, as a way to work towards a more liberated set of conditions for themselves and their loved ones, and broader populations, and, you know, whether it be urban communities or rural or suburban communities, you know, the broader constellation of the broader ecosystem with which they find themselves in. I think it's particularly important for me to think about community driven because I think I draw from traditions around the fight for community control, whether it be in education, public health, you know, libraries, that it's popularly and community-led popular and community-led or community-driven projects and work that is at the center of life. So the projects that I work on, I work on three that I would say are of various forms of that principle. The Barrio Education Project, which is why I'm here today, is primarily focused on, and maybe that'll be the one that I focus on here, is focused on the thinking about the ways young people in particular can take a lead in shaping their own lives and shaping the lives of their own communities. We're actually about to celebrate, or we're celebrating our 8th anniversary of existence, the project, and this was actually my dissertation project. And in that project, you know, we've engaged in a number of different kinds of methods, including historical archival. We've done oral histories. We have engaged in survey work. But at the heart of each of those, you know, different research kind of scholarly projects has been the interest, the questions of the young people themselves. In this particular iteration of the project that we are working on now, we have shifted from working with high school aged youth to middle school aged youth, and focused on a project called Nourishing Sanctuary, or Santuario Nutritivo. Nourishing Sanctuary is focused and is based on the previous cohorts of Barrio Ed Project, and they're centering the importance of mental health, well-being, and kind of overall whole well-being as the particular issue that young people here in Philadelphia, where I'm located, have really focused on and centered on really over the last 4, 5, 6 years, specifically in the time that we have been in action here. What that has led to is the development of a curriculum, a kind of emerging curriculum around an after-school club called Nourishing Sanctuary. And so we're celebrating the end of our time this year, and we only were able to we just transitioned, and so we launched a kind of pilot version of it. So it was a 6-week version of this after-school club at a couple schools here in South Philadelphia, where I'm at right now. And the thing that we really focused on here is thinking about our own identities, but also inviting young people to think about what does safety mean? Where is safety? Where do we feel joy? Where do we feel an opportunity to heal and to be ourselves? And so it's been really interesting for us to think about both sanctuary within and sanctuary without. The goal of the project, we've been really zeroing in on sanctuary within this series of sessions. But where we are going from here is to really think about, okay, as we're working on ourselves, how do we think about the questions and the conditions that we are living in, and what are the problems and things that we need to identify that prevent our communities from also feeling like a sanctuary? What kinds of precarity, toxicities, as I think Akira has pointed to, whether it be in schools, in their school buildings, or in their neighborhoods, that are of particular importance, and what then, as we need to develop questions about that, think then about how we can use that kind of inquiry to move into action, whether it be policy and or accessing more resources, political education of loved ones, family members, and other neighbors. It's very open, right? And so, and that's really what I mean with respect to community-led. So let me stop there, because I feel like I've been talking for a long time. And I'll get to this question of answerability in a little bit.
Thank you, Edwin. Let's go to Kate.
I just want to say that both Edwin and Akira, your answers are so amazing and inspiring. Excited to be on this panel with you both, and also with Nancy. For me, I also identify as a critical scholar. So my scholarship needs to lead to action and for the collective flourishing of all people. So I'm guided by a critical environmental justice lens, which means I look at the way in which the environment, particularly the urban environment, impacts overall well-being and health. And in order to do that, I spent a lot of time in the community before choosing any type of dissertation topic. And because I've just been working on my dissertation, I was a little limited in the amount of participation I could require from folks. And so my level of community engagement really came from spending 2 years prior to starting my dissertation in the community. I was aware that urban agriculture was a blossoming field, and that it was being used in a number of ways to address environmental health. And in being in the community, I started to see some disparities in how funding was being distributed, in how urban agriculture was being perceived in the mainstream media. And I also saw how Black and Brown growers were using urban agriculture as a form of resistance to rebuild their communities, which had been harmed by decades of disinvestment. So studying gardens for me became really important as a way of being in community, listening to community concerns, watching and observing how community members were responding to slow violence in the environment. And so for me, the engaged aspect was developing relationships, being present in the community, going to advocacy events, showing up at gardens and volunteering my time, building relationships that then built my research questions, and that then built my research design, with the intention of creating action that was in support of the grassroots movements for urban restoration. And so the work that I've been doing has been just that. It's led to incredible relationships, incredible depth of knowledge of how people experience slow violence in the environment, but also how folks are responding to that slow violence. Yes, Rob Nixon's slow violence, absolutely. And then how do we support those practices that are rebuilding cities, that are restoring neighborhoods and communities? For me, it's about breaking down barriers between scholarship and community, recognizing that there's been inequity in who has access to research, what that research does and means, and who's considered a scholar even. And so community engaged scholarship is really acknowledging that we're equal, and that local knowledge is so valuable and rich and often overlooked. And so partnering is important for, I guess, bridging that gap for me.
Thanks, Kate. And let's go to Nancy.
Sure. So thank you very much. Very rich contributions and thoughts. And I think this is a very good way to say what Akira said, is just how fungible and elastic this concept is. I tend to I tend to focus, like Kate, a little bit more on the scholarship. And at Rutgers here, we use the term publicly engaged scholarship. So the definition that I tend to work with is that the work that I do is to create knowledge through an academic community partnership or collaboration that advances science and directly benefits the public and community. And in that definition, I see the three parts that have been already talked about. That central to that is this collaboration with the community. And much like what Kate says, is that the goal is to flatten any hierarchy and to be respectful of the expertise that is brought, that the academic expertise is equivalent to the community or the lived experience. So that collaboration needs to be substantive and sustained and bi-directional. It's just not one directional, which is typically the case with public intellectual. That when you're a public intellectual, it's the knowledgeable academic is translating knowledge to the community, but it doesn't have that bi-directional flow, so that each is influencing the other to better understand what the issue is at hand. The other part is that the knowledge that's created, that is the scholarship, is ideally multi-leveled. It can influence theory in terms of advancing the theory about how we think about the community or how we think about the prison, that many times the theories that are currently used are old and dated and aren't really accurate. So there's oftentimes methodological advancements, there's empirical advancements, but it also must be applied. It has to be taken down so that it can actually be useful and meaningful. And then the next part of it that I see that is so critical is that translational part, which, much like the simultaneous translation at the UN, that whatever knowledge is created is that it's translated back into the language of the scholars from a variety of disciplines, because my research, I feel, the only way that I can accurately capture what I learn in the community is to draw on so many disciplines. And then I have to write to disciplines that I wasn't necessarily trained in. So I have to learn these languages to translate it so that I can influence the way science is moving. But also I have to translate it into the language of policymakers to direct consumers to stakeholders and citizens. So that there's a lot of translation that needs to be done. My lab is the criminal justice system, and I work with people under correctional supervision, people who are on probation and parole, residing in prisons and jails, people being adjudicated through the court systems. And I also work with people responsible for the operation of these systems, that when it's transactional in this way, I have to work on both sides and recognize that the only way that I can improve the conditions for the people who are experiencing the criminal justice system is if I can work also with the people who are in charge of enforcing the rules, regulations, and also set those rules and regulations. So that's more of that kind of the the research part of it, but I also engage in what I consider community-based participatory practice, where I literally in the lab, in the prison settings, develop peer-run programs inside the prisons that grow organically in response to the requests and the needs of the people who live there. So we have developed all kinds of programs, yoga programs, meditation programs, smoking cessation programs, exercise, nutrition, health. But again, it's very responsive to the needs of the individuals, and then making sure that once we do that, that they are prepared to then run those programs, run the centers, and they're empowered to take on those responsibilities. So that's kind of how I do my work, and also how I see my work in terms of its community engagement part.
Thank you, Nancy. My next question is, I'm going to ask each of you to talk a bit about how you first got started in community engaged research. I realize everyone on the call obviously is interested in community engaged research, but I bet there's a lot of folks that aren't necessarily doing this work now, but want to figure out how to dip their toe in the water and get started. So if you could talk a bit about how you first started doing this work, and I'm going to go in reverse, or I'll start with Nancy.
Sure. Well, for me, it started in the late 1980s. I was a mental health services researcher, and in that field, there's an ethos of nothing about us without us. And what that meant is that people with direct experience with mental illness should be directly and actively involved in research, practice, policymaking that affects and focuses on them. So the peer movement was very powerful in terms of its advocacy, and made it very clear to researchers and to practitioners, and even the NIMH, that they wanted to have a place at the table. And at studies section at NIMH, when we were reviewing grant applications, there was always a person with direct mental health experience there that was commenting on whether these proposals make sense, if they were really going to speak to an issue. And then in the late 1990s, I was working with an anthropologist, and she introduced me to grounded theory, which in my view of grounded theory really seeks to understand what really is before theories are laid on top of it. And for me, grounded theory stressed the importance of learning and hypothesizing from the ground level, and then identifying theories from different disciplines that might fit what is observed or how it needs to change. And so it was the combination of nothing about us without us and grounded theory that provided the foundation for the community research that I've done for the past 25 years. I've literally spent the past 15 years inside prisons and learning about the cultures inside of them, to figure out how to change those environments and what those resistant factors are. But I would have never been able to do this work for the past 25 years if I didn't have nothing about us without us and the foundation of grounded theory to tell me that I need to be in the community to be able to know what's really happening there, so that I can then use whatever knowledge that I have with the community to try to improve and make them more humane.
Thank you, Nancy. Let's go to Kate.
For me, similar to Nancy, I have been working in the policy arena for about 10 years. And so very familiar with community organizing and the tenets of community organizing, and equipping and empowering folks to influence policies and to have a say over their own lives. And so that was very important for me when pursuing my PhD. And actually, I've worked throughout my degree as a policy director, and then most recently for the last few years as an environmental justice coordinator for a local nonprofit, who actually reached out and asked me to work with them because of the knowledge I was learning at Rutgers. And so my work was really born out of just being in and active in community and listening, instead of, imposing what I thought might be helpful, but just literally listening for years to what folks were identifying as concerns and needs and ideas, and then using the knowledge and skills and access that I had at Rutgers to kind of make that connection for folks. So it, again, like Nancy mentioned, it's something that's just been very natural to me as a community organizer, a former social worker, and also as someone who is involved in the environmental justice movement. The movement itself was born out of a grassroots movement that believes in really democratic leadership and community empowerment, and also the fact that the folks who are having policies and decisions made about them should be at the table where those decisions are being made.
Thanks. Let's go to Edwin.
Yeah, I think first and foremost is the working as both an educator and as an activist. I was an elementary school teacher before getting into to my scholarship, but at the same time, I was also an activist. I was a New York City public school teacher, elementary school teacher for 5 or 6 years, during that time, I was also a very active member of the New York Collective of Radical Educators, or NYCOR, which is now in its 21st year, I think, as an organization, and I was an active member for 12 years. You know, the kind of part of our mission statement there that we always talked about is that the struggle for justice does not end when the school bell rings. And so, you know, for us, it has been, and for me, it continues to be about that my scholarship must ultimately be focused on education, organizing, and being an accomplice to liberatory work in communities. And so for me, you know, the activism that started around demilitarizing our schools, the fight against high stakes testing, were fundamentally understanding at the same time that we are in service of and advocating and working alongside families and our students who were feeling that harm. It was also imperative for us to understand where that harm was rooted, and that's in structural oppression, that's in a carceral state, that's in racial capitalism. And so for us, or for me, it was about thinking about how research would allow me to think more deeply and in more complex ways about these problems that everybody is feeling and has actual on the ground theories about, and that we needed to create space for that to inform and drive our action, our transformative liberatory practices. And so, you know, those are the kinds of principles that continue to ground the work that I'm doing now. And, you know, for me, so much of it is really indebted to being an educator, both in the classroom, in the formal classroom, but also in the streets through the kind of political work that I've done.
Thanks, Edwin. And Akira.
Yeah, just have to sort of agree with what others have said. By sort of being in community, you are sort of led to this work. So I had actually no experience with schools or environmental issues or anything before I just started showing up at meetings. And in this very long 30+ year fight of Philadelphians attempting to get like healthy and safe school facilities, there has been sort of like a narrative that emerges from district and city leadership that the people who complain about schools they are gendered in a way where they are seen as nagging. So they are often ignored. Their protests go unmet because they are, you know, gendered in a way that makes them both feminine, but also like not knowledge experts or not experts about this topic. So they were very much into the like everyone into the pool. How many people can we get involved in this problem of toxic schools so that more voices can perhaps garner more attention? So that was a role that I saw that I could fulfill, was being a new voice that had a new perspective, that maybe had a different lens of legitimacy that was not afforded to my colleagues in the community. And so I also feel as a member of an institution with more resources than any one institution should have, with a $20.5 billion endowment. That is very much my obligation for an institution that doesn't pay any property taxes towards those public schools that I study, to, as Edwin would say, kind of liberate those resources to the community. And so I also see that as something that is very, very important with community engaged resources, that it is kind of an active redistribution between these sort of institutions that hoard so much opportunity and advantage in those same neighborhoods where they are maybe not contributing in that way.
Thanks, Akira. My next question for you all is, how do you identify and connect with the groups that you work with? I'll loop back around. I'm going to start with Akira.
Again, just by showing up. It seems like a lot of people said that these groups and organizations sort of came to them. And I feel that same way. If you're sort of out there working with people, going to meetings, helping set up and take down chairs at the meetings, and doing that sort of what a lot of us miss with going to Zoom, that sort of pre and after meeting discussion where we get the best field notes. That is really helpful. I started off working with parents that, or actually they weren't parents, sort of these organizations that were privately fundraising for public schools called the Friends of Neighborhood Education. And that is how I sort of got in with other groups. So just by sort of being present within the action, whether it's direct action or lobbying or attending city council hearings or Board of Education meetings or whatever it is, just by being there and showing that you're available, I find is a really nice way to meet groups and have groups present you with their research questions and with their issues and their struggles. Again, in like a very sort of organic, but also how Nancy was talking about, that bi-directional way, that it's not like you coming in with your ideas about what people should be researching for action, but they're like, hey, we've been actually collecting data about this. I've been going to every Board of Education meeting for the last 16 years. Do you want those notes? And you're like, yes. And so I think like that's like a really just sort of like making yourself available, saying, hey, I have graduate students that will work. I'll pay them and they can work and do some of that research for you, do some of those right to know or Freedom of Information Acts that a lot of groups need, helping them navigate bureaucratic processes. And so just sort of being there, it takes a long time, or, that time's relative, but it takes longer than if you were to just set down your own stakes and say your own problems and research questions. But the work that you get done, I think is much better in that way.
Thanks. Edwin.
Yeah, I think part of it here is that for me, it's dialogical, right? So it's about engaging and maybe I think in some ways hits on that idea of bidirectionality, that I think part of my effort has been to work in such a way that I ask myself the question, I have these resources, and how might these resources, or I have access to resources that I know many of the communities that I seek to and already stand alongside don't have access to. So how could we potentially and creatively leverage some of those resources? Well, I'm not sitting on how many billions, Akira, but Swarthmore is no schlep at all with its little, it's a tiny little college with a $3 billion endowment. And so, thinking about how those resources can be made available to the people that I think not only that they have a right to, actually, and that, our institutions of higher education, I think, must be, and the point I didn't get a chance to make earlier, must be answerable to, and it's different from accountability and really thinking about who do we answer to. And I think higher education and myself, as a scholar with these kinds of commitments, feel that, who are answerable to are those communities that, upon which, entire careers are made, institutions are built. And that's often communities of color, marginalized communities of various kinds, you know, economic and so on. And so for me, it's, you know, engaging in the conversation. And I'll say, the last thing I'll say here is that as we engage in conversation and listen attentively and follow the lead of others, that all of that work, and I take from the work, disability justice movement, and Adrienne Marie Brown in particular, you know, writer, scholar, you know, writer, thinker, activist, but just this idea, and my students will often quote, right, the idea of moving at the speed of trust. And for me, that movement of that listening, that process of coming to know one another, identifying the problems that we desire collectively to address and answer, as well as collectively pursue joy and healing, I think are all things that need to be moving in such a way that trust is at the center of everything that we do. If it's about careers and it's about you know, the publications, which I'm not naive. I understand that is a pressure and that's something that we have to navigate. But if that's what you lead with, I think, then I personally, you know, to speak quite frankly, I just kind of think, don't do it, right? Don't engage, don't do this kind of work, because the potential of harm far outruns the potential of any kind of benefit that you would cultivate with a community. If we don't really center then instead this idea of building trust, building collaboration, building a kind of being engaged in the practice of being with one another, of community, that we wish to see in the world more broadly, because that's not the kind of lead logic of how our world works right now. And so we need to be in the practice of imagining and living in that other kind of world that I think we all not only want, but that we have a right to.
Kate.
What more is there to say other than that? That was perfect. I'm glad Akira mentioned the taking chairs, putting up chairs and taking away chairs as well. That is actually a line in my dissertation of like my methodology was being present in those spaces that aren't the official research capacity. A big part of my work, luckily for me, is gardens. So I got to spend a lot of time gardening, which feels like it's a little bit of cheating almost, because it's such an enjoyable activity. That also allows you to really build relationships with folks. You're digging in the dirt, you're sharing stories, you're sweating together, right? You're working towards this common goal. So for me, I lucked out picking gardens, but you know, spending time that had nothing to do with gathering interviews, just solely about being present with people in their communities was really important. Showing up in spaces that had nothing to do with my research at all. You know, folks asked me to come into their homes. They asked me to come into, you know, someone asked me to come to City Hall with them because they were worried about their garden tenure and they wanted somebody official to stand with them that made them feel better. Making time for those types of activities in my methodology was really important for me, as well as bringing food to potlucks and to, you know, showing up to protests and just being present with nothing in mind of what I was taking, but really trying to be deliberate about giving. I was warned at the very start of my research how exploitative researchers had been in, particularly in Philly and in Camden, in the urban agriculture field. Folks come in and ask questions and take data, and folks were really feeling burnt out. So it was made clear to me that I needed to be very careful to not be extractive. And so those extra activities that did take time, like Akira said, were really critical to building that trust and that reciprocity.
Nancy.
Yeah, so I agree with all of that. I think I'm just going to do a shout out for Amy Cuddy's book, Presence. I think if you really want to do this work, you really need to be present, and you need to know how to be present in an authentic way. And I think that's what we're really talking about here, is that you aren't being extractive, that you're not just hanging there, or you're saying, you know, I want you to give me something. And we all know that the criminal justice system, especially prisoners, have been so exploitive over time that when a researcher walks in, they immediately think that you're just going to take from them. So to build trust in those environments, you have to be there in an unofficial capacity to kind of hang out to the extent that you can hang out in prison. So I spent a lot of time hanging out and figuring out how to volunteer, how to offer something, but also to recognize that, you know, people would come up to me and said, I've never met a real professor before. And so just the fact that you would take away all of those labels and just be a real person was transformative in and of itself in terms of the process. So in terms of how I got connected with groups, you know, I think it is that nature that I want to understand, that I want to connect. But I also have to say I was really had an advantage because I had an NIMH funded advanced center for criminal justice and mental health. So I could form a table and I could invite people to the table. I didn't have to go to my university and ask them to throw me some of their largesse. I had funding. I had funding from foundations. I had funding from NIH. I could bring people to the table and say, what can we study for you? What can we do for you? And that is not in a way of saying I'm privileged, but saying I have been able to get something and I want to share it with you. What's the best way that we can use this in terms of what we do? How can we bring teams of people together so that we can make sure that this money goes to in the right ways to the right people? So, you know, and I think also just taking the resources you have, I would take, you know, we usually recycle computers here every 5 years. Those computers are still really good. So we could salvage those computers and bring them into prisons, and they weren't internet connected, but we could still get people learning Word, learning Excel, learning how to type their resumes so that they could do that. So there were so many ways in which we can take resources that are not useful, that are so useful in environments that are so devoid of useful resources. So I think there are so many ways that we can be creative to give, but also to ask, how can we use this money to study issues that are of importance to the agencies or to the individuals who are being impacted? So I do think that, you know, presence, authenticity, Amy Cuddy uses the term a community quarterback. And that's what I felt like my role was, to just bring all these people together and, you know, to talk about how we can build and coordinate. But you still have to be able to figure out how everybody can bring resources. And even in the prison, I would see men and women that would try to sneak food in to our meetings so they could share food, because that was important to them to be able to give back in their own ways. Or they would want to lead groups, so they wanted to learn yoga so they could lead the yoga groups. That you empower people along the way and you develop what I refer to as what is called the each one teach one approach, is that whatever I have, I will give to you. So if I know yoga, I'll teach you yoga. If I know how to do aerobics, I'll teach that to you, so that everybody's empowered. And then you just keep stepping it down so that everybody comes up to a level that feels very satisfying, and that we're all gaining during the process of growing towards the new reality.
Thanks, Nancy. Two things in the chat, as Dr. Rubin noted. Please, audience, feel free to drop any questions in the chat, and we'll get to those shortly. And also thank you, Akira, for dropping in the link to Presence the book. You know, the title of today's session is the do's and don'ts. And so this last conversation has been a nice segue into that. And so I first want to focus on the do's. You know, what are some things that you absolutely need to be doing, that you should be thinking about? And we'll start with the do's, and I'll go background the order. I'll start with Nancy.
Okay. So the do's, be present. Don't overpromise. I think that gets people in the way, that you say that you're going to solve everything. Don't overpromise. I think really figuring out how you establish trust, that you trust the process and that the people you're working with are trusting the process. I think you just have to be a person of your word. If you lose your word, if you lose your credibility, if you say you're going to be there and you don't show up, I mean, the women at the prison used to always say, hey, it's snowing outside. I don't think she's going to make it today. And somebody would say, she'll make it here even if she has to take a sled dog to get here. Yeah, I would show up because that's what I do. And you know, so many times people are let down, but I think your character really matters in terms of establishing the trust, the confidence, the belief that you are there. Also making sure that when you do learn something, you share and you bring it back. So I would always, after we would finish a study, I would bring it back and say, here's what we learned. Does this make sense to you? I just finished writing a book about my experiences that I've had with doing research in this way. And I had 5 people who were formerly incarcerated read my book and make comments. Their comments were so good that I went back to my editor to get extra word length or extra words so I can put their comments in as endnotes. And it made the book so much better because they're amplifying things that I say. So it's just ways that you're constantly giving information back and then allowing people to sculpt it in ways so that they can own part of it. I mean, back to the old Marxian where you have kind of feeling that you're no longer, you lose your embodiedness. But I think to make sure that any joint products that come out of it are shared, the content is shared, authorship is shared, funding is shared. I did a lot of joint grant writing so that there are cameras that keep people safe in the prisons because we wrote a grant and we got those cameras in there so that we can make sure that the world is made a better place. I mean, people would always talk about researchers. Yeah, they're just coming in here so that they can get their next book or they can get their next promotion. And that, that's not cynicism. That is direct experience. And I think we just have to change the face of researchers so we don't look exploitive. And we do that by making sure that every step along the way, we are open with the information, that we share the value of what we produce, and we give credit where credit's due. And I think those are the important dues that I've noticed over my 25 years of doing this work.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Kate, some of the do's.
Yes, all of that. And part of that for me, since I study urban restoration and slow violence, particularly in communities of color, as a white woman, it's really important for me to start all of my work with my positionality. And that's part of that being very transparent with folks, right? Like Nancy was talking about. So I start with my positionality and I'm honest and I'm humble that where I'm coming from is very different. So I am naturally going to have a bias. And so I need to have checks and balances in place to make sure that what I'm seeing and observing is actually what people are trying to communicate with me. And so that's part of the trust building and the building respect with folks is acknowledging the weaknesses of my own bias and my own perspective and asking for partnership in that aspect. And so I use reflexivity checks. So I'm always checking in and journaling, but then also checking in and doing stakeholder checks. So like Nancy mentioned, taking the work back to the community and saying, hey, what do you think of this? Is this reflective of what you were actually saying or doing? Does this make sense? And is this respectful? And, in doing that, part of that respect and part of that building trust means that I'm also open to being told no. And I'm open to being told that there are spaces and questions and things that I am not meant to study. And I'm not meant, to take and reproduce as my own data. And so being able to respect that has been really important for me and a learning experience as well. So again, just the sharing of knowledge, but also my positionality and making sure that I am respectful and honoring of, what story is mine to tell and am I telling it in the way that folks would want it to be told?
Thanks, Kate. Edwin, the do's.
I think do, and not to be too repetitive, but I think do start with the question, who is this for? Who are we answering to in asking the kinds of questions we're asking? What at the end of the day is the kind of impact that you would want, not just anything that's produced by, research and whatnot, but the very act of building community, of being in community has, these profound rippling effects on not just the people who are involved, but everyone that is affiliated, connected into that ecosystem in some way. So really starting with that question. The other two things I'll say is something that I often tell my students and that I think about in my own organizing and teaching is the importance of having a thick skin, but always working with an open heart. Yeah, I mean, this work is extremely humbling. And you know, we start at the disadvantage, you know, in particular when we're working with communities that we are not of, because that means that we have to work really hard to earn that trust. It is not given, and nor should it be given. And so that requires us to understand with a great deal of humility that when you do show up, right, as I think many of my colleagues here on this panel have noted, that it's not in the position of, you know, I'm the value add, but you know, but through your work, through your actions, through your capacity to listen, and to have an open heart, and to do those very basic things like, yeah, putting up tables, doing all of that kind of stuff, you know, bringing the snacks, that all of that is work that builds towards towards cultivating that kind of trusting relationship. The last thing I'll say is the importance of keep at the heart, do keep front and center both self and collective care. It's so easy, because this work is hard, it's easy to get discouraged. It's also easy to just be about the work to the point that you actually are harming yourself and harming others, or that, you know, entire collectives are harming themselves in the, you know, in the name of trying to work towards justice. But you know, in the 25 plus years that I've been doing this in various ways, at the end of the day, it ends up never being worth it if we have ultimately harmed ourselves in the process of trying to accomplish some important things. So it's, you know, trying to find that balance in a way that is about mutuality and interdependence, but also, you know, a kind of self-reflexive process of making sure that you are setting up your own boundaries, thinking about your positionality, as Kate said, and thinking about how to be in good practices where you continue to nourish yourself and nourish your loved ones, because otherwise we end up, you know, being no good to the movements that we are so deeply committed to.
Thanks. And Akira, some more dues.
Yeah, I feel like so many people have already covered all of the dues, but I do think very much in thinking about what Kate said about positionality, kind of like having some idea of what your values are, a little bit of like what Edwin said of like, who are you doing this for? Because both in my work with like public housing residents, which was not like super contemporary, but even in the work here with public schools, people want to do things that are not what you would have done. And you kind of have to make this decision, like, is this, you know, I feel like I know how this is going to turn out, and I don't think it's going to be particularly productive, but do I compromise the trust that I've built with this group by taking that stand? And that's like a fine line, I think, to navigate, is like when to sort of like voice your opinion and when to like, you know, make sure you're not taking up too much space in the room. And so I don't really have an answer for that, but I will say that is something that comes up a lot, and that you need to be kind of aware that you will fight, I think, with your community allies, not like in a physical way, but in a way that's like you're kind of battling back and forth, and being humble is really important, and listening is super important, but also I don't think that they will respect you as much if you sort of comply to everything that they say either. I think if you can actually articulate why you think it's not a great idea, even if you all decide to go forward with it, I feel like that's better for the long-term viability and trust than if they were to find out, you know, a year later that you actually didn't support this at all. You just kind of did that so they would, you know, keep working with you. And so those are issues that I didn't really foresee or see a lot of writing on in methods articles.
So true. Yeah. Are there any don'ts that we haven't talked about yet? Akira, I know you had to wait the longest for the do's, so I'll kick it back to you if you want to start with some don'ts.
I don't know. There's lots of don'ts, but I think one of the biggest don'ts is don't flatten every community member into the same archetype. So they're not all disempowered, vulnerable beings. Some people that I work in communities make more than me and like have like better homes and like have their careers all set aside and everything. And so I think there's a lot of times where you're like, I am the one with the power and they are the ones without it. And that's also not very true. So I think like engaging with the community as you would engage with colleagues, right? Like thinking of them as like dynamic people with dynamic needs and knowledges, and being very kind of intentional and mindful of that, very present. Nancy mentioned earlier that you're aware that there are differences within the community, and that your work and your approach to that work should sort of reflect those differences as well. And also like never rely on the university for money and reimbursements. Always find a way around that because yeah, it's bad. It's only gotten worse in recent years, I feel like, in order to like pay people. So get around it.
Edwin, don't.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely want to echo Akira's point about, I think about it as don't assume anything about anyone, because you really just don't know at the end of the day until you start engaging in the work with people, with folks that, that very quiet mom that comes to each meeting but doesn't say a word, and you think, oh, maybe they're just kind of not connected or not interested. But the fact that they keep showing up, and then you have a moment where you're learning new things about who they are and their histories, and then all of a sudden it's like they're one of your leaders, co-leaders and so on. So never assume anything. I think the other thing is don't be extractive. We've talked about it already, and I just want to echo it again. This work should never be with the intention of going in to extract anything from anyone. I think so much about Indigenous communities in particular, but I think all communities and communities of color, marginalized communities, their only relationship to higher education is an extractive one. And to most institutions is an extractive relationship. And we should never be guided by those kinds of intentions and expect to actually do the kind of transformative work that we have imagined ourselves being a part of. Yeah, let me stop there.
Kate.
Something that I have learned in a kind of a hard way, and I'm not good at it, is to not hide the uncomfortable data if you're going to publish it. So if you uncover things that are a little messy or complicated, but you're afraid of hurting feelings, don't publish that without first having the conversation with the community that you're engaged with. It just will make things really hurtful and compromise your data, really.
Thanks. And Nancy.
Sure. I just want to do a shout out with what Edwin had said, which is burnout is so easy here. And we really do have to take care of ourselves. And I'm speaking from experience where I really just got lost in the system for 10 years. And I don't think I saw Julia at all during that time. I mean, I had no time for myself. I survived it, but I really would say to anyone doing this, you can't be a one-person show. You really have to make sure that you pace yourself and kind of and have people around you that can be supportive. I think the other is that again, as an economist, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Things fall apart all the time. And especially if you're an assistant professor, and I did this work when I was an assistant professor, I took huge risks. I believed in my risks, but things can go wrong. When I was a full professor and I had an R01 to do a study, and I had done all the work, I'd worked with this prison system for years, I'd cultivated it, and there was a political change. I got caught in the crossfire. And even though they signed on to my contract, my grant, they would not approve my research protocol. And I was at risk of losing several millions of dollars because they would not let me put my study into the field. So fortunately, on my board was someone who was very well connected and got me into the Pennsylvania prison system. And so I immediately had to switch over, learn a whole new system to put a very large randomized control trial into a new system where I had no connections on the ground, versus the system I had for 10 years in New Jersey. So things can go wrong, but you got to have a backup plan, and a backup to the backup plan, and a backup to the backup plan, and a backup to that plan as well. So the other thing that I can tell from experience is you have to learn to listen to hear what's not said. Because if you miss the what's not said, but everybody else understands it, you're the one who's going to be left out. And you really have to learn to listen in an entirely different way. And I think that comes from also authenticity and being present, that it's just really important to learn how to listen. The other thing I think is important, especially in systems that are bifurcated by us versus them, which is like correctional officers and residents, you have to make sure that you don't take sides, because you need everybody's participation to understand that system, and you need everybody to work with you, because if one group decides not to work with you, it all falls apart. So I always try to tell people I'm an ambassador, or I'm Switzerland. I can understand from both sides, but I also have to remember that I can't take sides, because then I get lost in that process and I can't work within the system. So I think those are the things that I would say are mistakes that can be made, just to be very, very careful of that. But most importantly, to just take care of yourself, because this work is so nourishing. And I felt so gifted with everything that I got, that I kept on wanting to give more and more and more and more. But I also know that, my personal life suffered as a consequence of that. If I had to redo it, I would do the same thing, because I was just so committed to what I was doing. But I do think that other people should be wiser than me, and, try to find that balance that allows your passion to flourish, but also that you make sure that you take care of yourself and your life, so that you don't get lost in that process.
Thank you. I'm going to kick it over to Julia now to do some of the audience Q&A.
Thanks very much, Lauren. Such a great panel. I'm really enjoying this. So we have a couple of questions from Ellen Rose Ellison, and I'll just read them. And so she said, thanks for this great discussion. I'm a community psychologist, so everything you've shared resonates with me and my experiences in the academy and outside of it. I'm currently in a role at my university to build support and capacity for our colleagues who do community engaged research. My questions for the panel are: one, what are some elements of your institution that make your community engaged work feel more supported and or possible? And two, what are some ways your institution could better support your work and your community partners?
We'll just kick it open to anybody who wants to start us off.
Well, I'll just say that, unfortunately, because of a lot of the things that have been going on in the world and in the US over the last 3 years, that a lot of universities have found that the only way they can respond is by funding community research. So there have been a lot more pots of money, I think, available at the university level to make this research possible. In some disciplines, I won't say all for sure, some disciplines, tenure standards are starting to reflect community engaged research a bit more and public scholarship more, which has been useful. So you don't have to go through years of peer review with community co-authors. You can do other forms of, white papers or things like that that can be accepted. And Yeah, I'll stop there. But those are, I think, kind of like off the top of my head, 2 things recently that I've seen have been really, I feel are supportive of this research.
I'll just add, I think, you know, for a long time, the Eugene Lang Center for Civic and Social Responsibility at Swarthmore has been not just within the college, but I think in our region and across the country has been involved and supportive of cultivating this kind of work amongst faculty members, those that are already doing it, but also those who are new to it but have interest in you know, reorienting their work to do this kind of work. I will say perhaps the need for more support. Actually, I wanted to jump onto Akira's point about, you know, that yes, I mean, we're living in the triple, quadruple pandemics of climate injustice, you know, COVID-19, anti-Blackness, you know, and anti-immigrant sentiment, and so on. And so, so institutions, I think, have been compelled, some kicking and screaming, others much more willingly, to support and figure out ways to reframe and recast how they are, their image, their brand. And so, and I'm speaking, you know, not just of my institution, but just broadly. And so it's this really tricky thing that I think we need to negotiate. And so the thing I would like institutions to do more of is to be more reflective and clarify where they actually stand, so that it isn't just in word, that they are actually, in fact, interested in transforming what and how they do it and what they're doing it for, in order to support faculty members who are, in many ways, you know, we were kind of like the misfit toys that were just kind of hanging out, and it's like, oh, that's that angry guy over there who is always like has some beef and something or other. And now all of a sudden, you know, the spotlight is on us. And, you know, but I think the smart institutions will actually listen to those angry people, you know, and why, and actually think about, well, why are they angry? And so, you know, and what voices do they actually represent or kind of recenter in the college, you know, in like faculty conversations and strategic planning processes and so on and so forth, so that in fact, we actually lead in, you know, we actually use the words and the rhetoric as a kind of spark for actual change within, that I would love. That's what, to me, like, that would make me feel supported, right? You know, if we started with that, then I think the money would follow. But right now it feels like the money is leading, and that is concerning for me.
Anybody else want to jump in, or in terms of these 2 questions? Okay.
I think I'm too new since I'm just starting this fall.
Nancy, did you want to add anything?
Well, I mean, I'll just say, I mean, obviously I'm more advanced in my career. I also sit on the promotion review committee here at Rutgers. So, and I've been strategically involved with on the guidance for publicly engaged scholarship as we for our faculty here. And there's also going to be a bigger discussion at Rutgers that will lead to a major report. And we're trying to develop the metrics and all of those types of things so that we can make sure that we know what it is. I mean, we've struggled a lot with knowing what it is. And even in today's conversation, you know, that elasticity of the concept that Akira talked about at the very, very beginning, to really distinguish, for example, if you look at extension research by nature is publicly engaged, That is what they do. They do very little scholarship, at least at some land-grant colleges. They're much more doing technical reports, working with the farmers, doing those types of work. But their work is very publicly engaged. but it's not so much on the scholarship side, but they still can get promoted through all of their technical reports. Their scholarship is much later, but they're doing hundreds and hundreds of reports. So, and then there's the public intellectual, a very different version of this. They're very active. They're very much talking at the community. They're very much talking about what they know and disseminating that. And trying to make sure that they take what expert knowledge they have, whether they're giving testimony at the State House or whether they're writing books that digest research that can make it accessible. But a lot of it is translational. It's not saying that it's not important, but when we talk really about publicly engaged research, we're really got to make sure that it's got that integrity to the collaboration. It is just so important that we're really able to see that process, that you're using that technical expertise, that there's scholarship that's being produced at the same time, that there is an impact on the community, and that we can measure what that impact is so we can give credit to it. And that's really difficult. And that's why it's so, at least at Rutgers, when people go up for promotion, you're allowed to use experts in the field that can speak to the impact of your research. They're not academics, but they are the experts in the field who can be the part of your external letter writers. So for example, I recommended in my promotion packet to have the Secretary of the Department of Corrections. He knew the work that I was doing. He had that stature that he could say what my impact was on the system. So that you want to make sure that you plan for that and that you can see that you're allowed to use those kinds of, to get those types of letters so that you can cultivate that. So we're making all kinds of inroads to try to formalize this, because I think the administration here at Rutgers and many other universities, when I was on the academic leadership tour and we went to the different Big Ten, would see that there is very much this articulation of publicly engaged scholarship. There's a communication now across the universities about how to measure it. How are you measuring it? How are you making sure that you're measuring it accurately? If you curate an art show, is that publicly engaged scholarship? No. How can you have art without that? So, I mean, you get into all these complications so that you can really figure it out. But what junior folks or people who are moving up and still getting promotion, it is so important in your personal statement. And Julia knows that I just gave a presentation on this to some through the university about how important it is in your personal statement to make sure that your reviewers understand what you do. You've got an education role that you have to play. You have to tell them what this collaboration is. You have to explain how it works. You have to talk about the impact. You have to figure out how to measure that impact so that you can say how you've changed the community and demonstrate in ways that are meaningful. And then you can have people that will then echo that, who are in positions that can speak to that. So I really see from my vantage point that there is this overarching effort to try to formalize this, to be clear about it, to measure it, and to acknowledge it in promotion decisions. And I can tell you that I see it every time, for the past, I went up on publicly engaged scholarship for my promotion to distinguished professor. So we respect it, it is honored, it is valued, but it is the candidate's role to make sure that we understand it. If you don't do it, you can't wait for somebody else to do it because they are not grounded in what we do. So we have an education role that we have to play. So I hope that's helpful.
That's great. Thanks, Nancy. So Jen Maggie, I hope I pronounced that right, from Swarthmore's Lang Center, had a question. She asked, if you do this work alongside college students as research assistants or as students in courses you teach, how do you prepare them, yourself, and your partners to both confront slow violence and move at the speed of trust?
Well, this is a question that's actually come up a lot. I teach only graduate students. I'm in a planning program. It is a 2-year program. And our university is in West Philadelphia. Philly is the largest poorest city. And so there's been like a lot of harm from the university towards communities. And we are very intentional about not taking students to like play in that sandbox without those sorts of, so our university has a lot of resources about the history of the university and the neighborhood and, you know, move bombing and all of the kind of like long histories from displacement and urban renewal to the present. But it's still, I think, like not enough. So I'm really intentional with the students that I take into the field. Usually, if I work with undergrads, I like to make sure that they're from Philly, that they went to public school in Philly, where they have some background knowledge, because it's just like, you know, these are fights that people have been fighting for like 40 years. Like the acronyms alone is like 2 weeks of like deep, intense study. So it's really helpful to have people with that knowledge, because, you know, the academic calendar doesn't really make it easy to do that sort of deep learning when you need a research assistant for 8 weeks in the summer and you just need them to do interviews and you actually don't have that time to do that. So I like to build longer relationships with college students as research assistants, because I think, you know, those who are only going to be with me for a short time can do like offsite work, but students who are going into the field, I like for our relationships to be a little deeper and stronger.
Thanks, Akira. Does anybody else want to jump in?
I can just say I've brought probably 30 or more research assistants into the prison with me. And I'm very careful about that, because people who are in prison have been wounded. I do trauma research. They have been wounded by discrimination, by bias, by implicit biases. And I need to make sure that my research assistants are aware of how they think about people who are in prison. And if they can't get past that, if they can only see the crime, then they can't really go with me. I would like to take them, but we can't do harm to people because of because the research assistant's just not there yet. And I have to say, much of my qualitative research, I get such positive feedback about the research assistants I bring in. And I even have one quote that's in my book where somebody says, "Where do you find these people? They're so nice. They're so respectful. I never thought that there were people like that." And so many of the research assistants and the people I've worked with inside prison have been so healed by the experience of working together. And I have one example. There was one time I was at a Supermax facility. We were supposed to go in. There was game playing that the officers didn't want us there. So they did an alarm, which meant we couldn't go in, delayed us. So I said, okay, we're going to go and we're going to look at the files first, and we're going to extract the data that we needed from the files. Big mistake. Because when you see the files and you see what people have done, oftentimes in very stressful circumstances, fear kicks in. And so when my research assistants then went to meet the people, they were afraid of them because of what they read in the files. But if I would have done it the reverse, where they just saw them as people, they wouldn't have had those same biases. So it's just so important to make sure that you prepare people, that you ask them if how they really think about the people who've committed crimes, and whether they can set those biases aside, and be kind. And again, we do all the types of things that Kate was talking about. We set up tables together, we clean up. We're always, for example, the simple things. We have computers that we bring in. We'll bring 30 computers into a prison, and we make sure that everybody who sits down at a computer station, that they see us wiping it off with disinfectant wipes, and we give them a hand wipe. And in prison, cleanliness is so important to the men and women. It is such an honoring thing to do by saying, no, you can't sit down there. I want to clean all of this for you, and then let them sit down. And just that in itself is just a statement of just, we respect. and that starts that process of trust with the process. So I think there's many ways in which we communicate through our actions to say, I see you, I understand, and I validate what your preferences are. And to teach people, students, to be able to have that level of understanding, I think informs both their future research, but also their character and the people they will be as they move forward.
Thank you very much. Kate, Edwin, did you want to add anything, or are you good to? Okay. So the next question is from Joanne Williams, and she wanted to know what the role of the university IRB has been in your work. And there's one last question after that that we can hopefully fit in, which is just about funding.
I'll jump in and say the IRB is a whole journey. Especially, you know, for me, working with young people, having to think about it. I think it was Wendy who said you know, when you're writing your statements for, you know, promotion or tenure, et cetera, or when you're writing, you know, for grants, et cetera, it's a bit of education work that you need to do. And, you know, IRBs are funny little creatures in that, you know, it really depends. In the past, for example, at Swarthmore, we've had times where the IRB was directed by someone who was more trained in medical, like a medical kind of clinical model of IRB. And so coming in with sociological, more, you know, qualitative oriented kinds of projects were often, it was a struggle to get them passed. And then, you know, things have changed, you know, primarily because the kind of the framework for thinking about what a study even is and what it does is, there's more kind of a favorable, more understanding position of it. Whereas, yeah, so, you know, I think part of it is that, but, you know, I think the point I wanted to make is how much education work we had to do to just to kind of lay the groundwork and explain what it is we're trying to do. So it's an uphill battle, I think. And, you know, I haven't always been successful. Sorry, my young people, speaking about undergraduates, they're all just leaving. So I'm like, I love them. Yeah, I think it's just a deeply challenging piece that we have to just kind of stay with, you know, kind of like go on working on it.
So I'll just say that when I started this out, I agreed with Edwin that IRB did not understand criminal justice and mental health research. I spent a lot of time education on the education mission to help them understand. I also brought in resources and brought in some mental health law academic to help us work with them to develop some documents that would be useful, that would make it easier for us to work with them. So I think you have to make the IRB your friend, like you do in every situation. You have to have them understand what you're doing. If you can bring any resources to bear to make it easier. Our IRB here at Rutgers is so overworked. It is one of the most stressful jobs to have. Their turnover is so high. Because the work is just very stressful. So I just strategically brought resources in, brought experts in. We developed the documents that we needed. We developed a protocol on how we were going to submit our applications, and then how we were going to work when there was a misunderstanding, so that we could get things through the process. So anything that you can do to make friends, get to have a face-to-face, don't do things through email because they're just too busy. Go out to lunch, stop by, do the same things you do in the community to make a friend. But you just have to make that group your friend. Otherwise, they can slow things down, and you move at the speed of the IRB that is overwhelmed and not knowledgeable about the work that you do. So a little bit more investment.
So just a final quick question about funding, whether how you found the funding environment for this kind of work. And we'll wrap that up, I guess. I'll turn it back over to Lauren.
This is also something that in recent years I feel like is changing, where there is funding available, but they're not really quite sure how. I think like a lot of foundations are trying to do community funding, but they really don't get it. So you end up seeing a lot of the same sort of like institutional projects being funded that are not really what I would consider community engaged research, but like may tangentially work with a group. And so I think that's something that's hard because usually when you're doing like community engaged research, the metrics and outcomes are not super well defined at the onset when you're writing a grant proposal, and that makes it difficult. So it's one of those things where you have to do the project before you can get the funding for the project. So that I think could change. I know like in terms of like education, like Spencer Foundation has been getting better with doing more community-based grants. I think even WT Grant is starting to turn around on that. So it's like, I think coming, but right now it's still like a little, they're like kind of unsure when you're like community stipends, $40,000.
Great. Anyone want to add to that?
I just wanted to add really quickly, and I wholeheartedly agree with Akira and Akira's earlier point about, you know, there is more interest, and so I think that's a good thing, you know, as complicated as it is. I will also say that it's a sustained, it's kind of like, for me, it's ended up feeling like I'm running a nonprofit organization in the sense that like the grants, like living from grant to grant is challenging, particularly when you want to do sustained projects over time. And so, but I think that also opens you up to thinking about other resources that are more community focused rather than research focused, because that's another entry, and there's a lot of money flowing into those kinds of things right now, or, you know, over recent years. And so, so you actually have another kind of pot to look into that. And, you know, community groups or, you know, partners are often really interested in also like helping to put, you know, packages and proposals together so that they, you know, so that the money actually goes to them and the research bit is like a tiny fraction of it. And so, you know, which is, I think, as it should be in many ways. And so, you know, you want to be kind of having an ear to the ground for those kinds of opportunities alongside some of the, you know, traditional scholarly foundations like Spencer and WT Grant and, you know, Woodrow Wilson, et cetera.
Yeah, I agree with that. I've certainly piggybacked on service grants, and they usually have an evaluation component. So that's a really good way to get some funding. And it's also consistent with building helping the organization with grant writing. So they build those skills at the same time. Foundations, again, you got to go meet the foundation presidents and try to have a conversation with the foundations to say, this is what I'm wanting to do. And, you know, ideally, if you have a big enough picture, you can start thinking about maybe having an umbrella organization or a center or a program that would allow you to have some flexibility in it, which is why I liked my center so much, because then I was able to write my reports. And I think that's another thing that the university could really do, is to help professionalize reports. It takes a lot of time to make them really look good. My center did that. We just had great policy briefs that we did. Anything that we did, we were constantly churning out the information on new interventions on mental health courts or drug courts, and we were updating the research. But, you know, you can have a part of the university that can help stylize those things so that you can get those reports out so you can still have the time to do your scholarship. So I think that there's ways in which you can build those within the foundations, but, you know, you guys it might be useful to think about collaborating, you know, something that, you know, my center was was a kind of a virtual center. It was a coordination with Penn, with several other universities, that I said I couldn't do this research at just my university because I needed people that were at other universities. So I made it a collaborative, which was meant that I could invest in other states and other universities to really disseminate this research faster. So I think there's a lot of creative ways that you can do that to develop conversations with different funding agencies. And again, coming back to the federal government, there are service like SAMHSA, if you do substance abuse, or if you do mental health, and also NIMH. They have had specific RFAs out for community participatory research. On COVID, on other types of things. So you're seeing it also at the federal level, that they're recognizing that they want to engage this type of research, and they're setting up specific initiatives for that. So, you know, I think on all three levels, there's ways in which you can get funding, but again, it takes that investment to get that.
Great, thank you all very much. I'm turning back over to Lauren.
We're at time, so thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you all to our attendees for your great questions. Before we formally adjourn, just a quick plug. If you're not already a member of Scholar Strategy Network, please do join us. I will drop the link in the chat with more information, or just reach out to any of us and we'll be happy to get you started, but we'd love to have you if you're not already a member. But thank you again to everybody.